I married Thomas Thornwood to pay off my family's debts, standing at the altar in a gown that belonged to my stepsister. Choices vanish quickly when your father leaves behind more debt than memories, and when the medical bills from a mother's final years pile up like heavy stones on your chest. My stepmother, Eleanor, had been all too eager to leverage that crushing weight to secure her own salvation. When her biological daughter, Beatrice, fled the estate 3 days before the wedding, terrified of the dark rumors surrounding the reclusive, scarred tycoon she was meant to marry, Eleanor did not hesitate to offer a substitute. She dragged me out of the small, drafty sewing room, where I spent my days quietly mending the family's worn garments, shoved me into the back of a hired car, and told me that if I did not walk down the aisle, the bank would seize the house by morning. I was not a bride. I was collateral. The stone chapel was freezing, the air thick with the suffocating scent of melting wax and damp earth. It was a stark, bitter contrast to the calculated, sterile nature of the transaction about to take place. I stood at the front of the nave, drowning in a dress that was never meant for me. Beatrice's gown was a chaotic confection of ivory silk and ostentatious gold trim, designed for a woman who thrived on being the center of attention and demanded the room's absolute surrender. On me, the bodice gaped, the heavy corsetry digging painfully into my collarbone, and the massive skirts pooled around my feet like spilled milk, white, flawless, and entirely meaningless. Eleanor stood in the shadows near the choir stall, her sharp gaze pinning me to the cold flagstones, silently daring me to ruin her carefully orchestrated survival plan. I kept my head bowed, waiting for the storm to break when the groom realized he had been given the wrong woman. When the heavy wooden doors at the back of the chapel finally groaned open, the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. He walked down the aisle with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who owned the very grounds that he stepped on. Thomas was a man carved from winter stone, his reputation as a ruthless, untouchable architect of corporate empires preceding him like a chilling wind. I braced myself for the anger. I expected him to shout, to demand where his beautiful chosen bride had gone, to tear up the marriage contract right there on the altar and leave us to our ruin. But he did not. He stepped up beside me, the faint, clean scent of rain and dark cedarwood clinging to his thick wool coat, and he simply looked down. He did not look at my face, which was barely shielded by a thin layer of imported tulle. He did not look at the garish gold lace that Eleanor had insisted upon. He looked at my hands. The sleeves of my stepsister's dress were absurdly long, the heavy lace cuffs swallowing my fingers entirely. When the priest stepped forward and offered the silver fountain pen to sign the registry, I could not even grip the cold metal. My hands shook violently, a humiliating tremor born of exhaustion and deep unmoored fear. A wave of heat rushed to my cheeks, but before the priest could clear his throat to urge me on, I moved. Slowly, deliberately, I used my left hand to fold back the heavy lace of the right sleeve, once, twice, 3 times. I folded the suffocating fabric back, just enough to bare my trembling wrist and the pale skin of my hand. I took the pen. I pressed the nib to the heavy parchment and signed my name. Clara Vance, where Beatrice's elegant signature was supposed to be. The tall man beside me watched the entire movement. He watched the desperate, quiet dignity of bearing my own hand, his dark eyes tracking the violent tremor in my fingers, and then, without a single word of protest, without turning to demand an explanation from my stepmother hiding in the shadows, he reached out and took the pen directly from my grasp. His fingers brushed against mine for a fraction of a second, warm, calloused, and startlingly steady. He signed his own name with sharp, decisive strokes, the black ink bleeding permanently into the paper. The transaction was complete. The car ride to his ancestral estate was a masterclass in heavy, unspoken boundaries. The afternoon storm had finally broken, and heavy rain beat against the tinted glass of the town car, a relentless, chaotic drum that isolated us entirely from the rest of the world. I sat as close to the passenger door as physically possible, the massive tulle skirts of the stolen gown crushing between us on the leather seat, serving as a physical barrier of deceit and debt. My new husband sat on the far side, staring out the window into the gray wash of the Pacific Northwest, his jaw set in a hard, unreadable line. His presence demanded no conversation, required no forced smiles, and expected no performance of newlywed joy. It was a profound, shocking relief. I did not have to pretend to be a blushing, enamored bride, and he did not pretend to be a doting, affectionate savior. We were simply two strangers sitting in a moving metal box, bound by a piece of paper and a silent understanding. Thornwood Manor rose from the dark tree line of ancient cedar forests like a forgotten, sleeping fortress. It was a sprawling estate built of dark, rough-hewn stone, featuring sharp crescent gables and towering, narrow windows that reflected the turbulent, weeping sky. There were no grand welcome parties waiting in the driveway, no lined-up staff to greet the new lady of the house, no fanfare of any kind. There was just the heavy oak front door and the overwhelming, timeless scent of old wood, beeswax, and polished marble. He did not offer his arm to help me up the front steps. He did not pause to see if I was struggling with the weight of the wet silk dragging behind me. He walked straight through the cavernous foyer, his footsteps echoing sharply against the stone floor, leading me down a long, dimly lit corridor that smelled faintly of old paper and rain. He stopped before a set of massive, intricately carved double doors and pushed them open. We stepped into the library wing. It was a breathtaking, cavernous room filled with towering mahogany shelves that stretched to the vaulted ceiling, a cold stone hearth, and a massive bay window overlooking the restless gray sea. Attached to the far end of the library was a private bedroom, simply furnished with dark wood and heavy linens, entirely devoid of the suffocating, gilded luxury I had expected from a man of his immense wealth. He stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the dim light from the corridor, and looked at me, breaking the visual silence he had held since the altar. "This is your space," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards beneath my feet. "No one will disturb you here. The staff has been instructed to give you complete privacy. You will not be expected to entertain, and you will not be expected to join me unless you choose to." He did not wait for a thank you. He did not offer a grand tour of the estate, nor did he make any demands regarding the marital bed. He simply turned and walked away, pulling the heavy double doors shut behind him. The brass latch clicked into place with a quiet, absolute finality that echoed softly in the vast room. I stood alone in the center of the library, drowning in my stepsister's dress, surrounded by thousands of unread books and the heavy scent of cedarwood. Other women might have cried in that moment. Other brides might have felt abandoned, insulted by the immediate clinical distance, or terrified of the isolation. But as I listened to the steady rhythm of the rain, lashing against the tall glass panes, I let out a long, slow exhale, feeling the tight knot in my chest loosen for the first time in months. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. The first night in the library wing was surprisingly peaceful. I expected to lie awake, terrified of the man I had just bound my life to, terrified of the long shadows stretching across the cavernous house. But the silence of Thornwood Manor was fundamentally different from some of my stepmother's home. There, silence had teeth. It meant Eleanor was calculating her next cruel remark, or Beatrice was quietly plotting a way to shift the blame for a mistake onto my shoulders. Here, the silence felt structural. It felt like a thick, impenetrable stone wall built deliberately between me and the punishing demands of the outside world. Morning came quietly. No trumpets, no grand shift in the universe, just a pale, hesitant beam of light slipping through the tall windows, brushing against the spines of the old books like Ekaseng thought. I rose from the heavy bed, my bare feet sinking into the woven rug. The ivory silk wedding dress lay crumpled in the corner of the room where I had finally managed to peel it off the night before, looking like a discarded skin that no longer belonged to me. I found simple, clean garments neatly folded inside the heavy wooden wardrobe, soft cotton and warm wool, entirely devoid of lace or gold trim. I dressed slowly and wandered into the attached dressing room, the chill of the marble floor grounding me in the reality of the new day. The space was pristine, the air carrying the faint, sterile smell of cleaning soap and cold air. I walked toward the large vanity mirror, running my hand along the edge of the polished stone counter. And that was when I saw it. Sitting perfectly in the dead center of the vast, empty vanity was a small, dark amber glass vial. It had a simple silver stopper, and there was no note, no ribbon, no explanation attached to it. My heart gave a strange, uneven flutter in my chest. I reached out, my fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second, before touching cool metal of the stopper. I pulled it free. The scent hit the air instantly. Lavender. Not the synthetic, overpowering perfume Beatrice used to drench herself in, but the raw, earthy, herbaceous scent of crushed lavender fields, baking under a late summer sun. It was my mother's signature scent. Before she grew sick, before the debts consumed my father, she used to keep a small pouch of dried lavender beneath my pillow to chase away the nightmares. It was the scent of a childhood I had lost a decade ago, the absolute essence of safety and unconditional care. I held the small glass vial in my trembling hands, closing my eyes as the aroma filled the sterile dressing room, bringing an unexpected burn of tears to the back of my throat. How could he have known? Did he have his people investigate the quiet, overlooked stepsister when he realized Beatrice was gone? Did he know he was marrying Clara all along? Or did he somehow see the deep, silent grief buried in my eyes when I folded back those lace cuffs at the altar? I placed the vial back onto the marble, my hands still shaking slightly, and walked out into the main expanse of the library. The room felt different in the morning light. The towering shelves seemed less imposing, the thousands of leather-bound volumes offering a quiet invitation rather than a wall of judgment. I approached the massive mahogany desk situated near the bay window, running my fingers over the edge of the polished wood. I noted a fine layer of undisturbed dust coating the surface, indicating the desk had not been used in quite some time. But right in the center of the leather blotting pad, the dust had been carefully wiped away. Resting in that clean, empty space was an old, fabric-bound book of poetry. The cover was faded to a soft, muted blue, the corners frayed from years of gentle handling. I pulled the heavy chair back and sat down, staring at the book for a long moment before reaching out to open the cover. The pages fell open naturally to the middle, the spine broken perfectly to reveal a specific passage. Laying flat against the yellowed, aged paper was a single, brittle sprig of dried lavender. It was pressed carefully against the text, acting as a makeshift bookmark. I brushed my thumb gently over the dried flowers, feeling the fragile texture of the petals, and looked down at the words it highlighted. It was a poem about quiet endurance, about the unseen roots of a tree, growing deep and strong in the dark, cold earth, long before the branches ever dared to reach for the sun. I sat there in the silence of the massive library, the scent of lavender drifting in from the other room, mingling with the smell of old paper and rain. I had spent my entire life trying to shrink, trying to take up as little physical and emotional space as possible so that my stepmother and stepsister could shine. I was the mender of torn seams, the quiet shadow in the hallway, the girl whose name was only spoken when a chore needed to be done or a debt needed to be paid. Yet this man, this feared, reclusive tycoon who was supposedly a monster of industry, had quietly reached into the dark, pulled out a piece of my own fragile history, and left it waiting for me in the morning light. Not a grand declaration, not a hollow promise of love, just a small glass vial and a brittle flower. He had not built a prison for me in this remote stone manor. He had built a sanctuary. And as I read the lines of the poem again, listening to the wind howl against the stone walls outside, I realized that for the first time in my life, I was entirely safe. The passage of time at Thornwood Manor was not measured in the frantic, anxious ticking of clocks or the harsh demands of a social calendar. It was measured in the slow, deliberate accumulation of quiet evenings, in the steady burning of cedarwood logs in the vast stone hearths, and in the gradual dismantling of my own defensive walls. For the first 2 months of our marriage, my husband and I occupied the same sprawling estate, like two solitary ships, navigating a deep, fog-draped harbor. We did not force conversation. We did not pretend to be swept up in a grand theatrical romance. Instead, we built a sanctuary out of the silence. The estate itself was a labyrinth of dark stone and crescent glass, a fortress hidden deep within the sprawling cedar forests. In the beginning, the sheer scale of the manor had felt oppressive. I was used to making myself small, shrinking into corners, to avoid Eleanor's sharp reprimands or Beatrice's demanding tantrums. But Thomas did not fill the space with noise or expectations. He gave me the entire library wing as my undisputed territory, a silent acknowledgement that I was entitled to take up space. On rare mornings, Mrs. Gable would linger when bringing fresh firewood, her quiet voice blending with the crackling hearth as she spoke of her sister's vacant cliffside cottage on the coast, a distant place where the air tasted of sea salt and absolute solitude. It became a comforting thought, a quiet escape held only in my mind. Our shared language was not spoken, it was brewed. Every night, exactly at midnight, the heavy mahogany doors of the library would open with a soft, familiar click. Thomas would step into the room, bringing with him the faint scent of old rain and dark wool, carrying a simple wooden tray. On it rested our chamomile tea set. It was not the gilded, ostentatious porcelain that my stepmother, Eleanor, would have demanded for a man of his vast wealth. It was a modest chipped ceramic set, glazed in a deep, soothing indigo, the cups heavy and warm against the palms. He would set the tray down on the low table, between the velvet sofa and his leather armchair. The ceramic clinked softly against the polished wood, a sound that quickly became the anchor of my daily existence. He never demanded that I join him. He simply poured the tea, the fragrant steam rising into the cool book-lined air, and sat back in his chair with a heavy volume resting on his knee. Sometimes love doesn't knock, it waits. It waits in the spaces between the ticking of the grandfather clock. It waits in the amber glow of the firelight, reflecting off his scarred profile. It waits in the absolute, unyielding patience of a man who understood that trust could not be commanded. I take exactly half a spoonful of sugar in my chamomile tea. It is a trivial thing, a meaningless fraction of domestic geometry that no one in my previous life had ever bothered to notice. In Eleanor's house, I drank whatever was left over, usually cold and bitter. During our first week of this midnight ritual, I would carefully reach across the wide table to pull the small sugar bowl toward my cup. By the second week, I noticed it was placed slightly closer to my side of the tray, and by the beginning of the second month, a new choreography had silently emerged. The moment I lifted my small silver spoon, Thomas would pause his reading, without looking up from his pages, without uttering a single word, to break the peaceful quiet. His large, calloused hand would slide the ceramic bowl across the mahogany surface, stopping it exactly 1 inch from my saucer. He did it instinctively. He had memorized my small, insignificant habits not because he wanted praise, but because he was actually watching me. He was paying attention to the ghost who had always been invisible. Every time the rough ceramic scraped softly against the wood, a fresh wave of warmth would bloom in my chest, melting another layer of the frost I had carried for years. I was no longer a transaction. I was a person who occupied space in a quiet room, whose presence was noted and accommodated with effortless grace. This quiet, invisible care extended far beyond the boundaries of the library. It was during the 4th month of our arrangement, on a crisp Tuesday afternoon, when Thomas had traveled to the city to oversee his corporate empire, that the true depth of his protection was revealed to me. The autumn chill had already begun to bite at the stone walls of the estate, turning the sprawling grounds into a tapestry of copper and gold. I had wandered into his private study to return a book on architectural history he had left on the dining table. The study was a reflection of the man himself, intimidating, anchored by dark stone, filled with a heavy scent of ink and aged leather. I set the book down on the corner of his massive desk, preparing to leave, when my eye caught the edge of a familiar object resting inside a partially open drawer. My breath hitched violently in my throat. I froze, my hand hovering over the polished wood. It was my mother's cedarwood box. The brass hinges were slightly tarnished, the wood worn smooth at the corners from years of being held by trembling hands. It was the only tangible piece of my mother I had left, after the medical bills had swallowed her life, and the debts had consumed my father. It contained her handwritten letters, her final thoughts, and the clumsy, charcoal childhood drawings I had made for her when I was 7 years old. 3 days before the wedding, Eleanor had confiscated this box. My stepmother had locked it away, a cruel insurance policy to guarantee my compliance. She had threatened to throw it into the incinerator if I dared to embarrass her or back out of the substitute arrangement. I had wept silently in the drafty sewing room, believing my mother's final words were lost to the ashes. My fingers shook as I reached to the drawer and pulled the heavy box out into the pale daylight. It smelled faintly of dried lavender and old sorrow. I opened the brass latch. It gave a soft, familiar click. Inside, resting perfectly undisturbed, were the stacks of fragile, yellowed envelopes. The spidery, elegant handwriting of my mother stared back at me. The fading ink, a testament to a love that had once been my entire world. Beneath the letters lay the thick, smudged paper of my childhood drawings. The letters were tied with a faded velvet ribbon. I carefully untied it, my thumbs tracing the elegant curves of her signature. She had written to me about strength, about enduring the winter seasons of life, promising that spring would eventually arrive. Eleanor had weaponized this profound loss, using my mother's memory as a bargaining chip to sell me into a loveless marriage contract. She had calculated the exact price of my obedience, but she had miscalculated the man who had bought my debt. I sank into the heavy leather chair behind his desk, clutching a letter to my chest. The tears I had refused to shed at the altar finally spilled hot and fast down my cheeks. How had it arrived here? Eleanor would never have surrendered it willingly. Thomas must have known. He must have seen the desperation in my eyes. He must have recognized that a woman does not walk to the altar like a lamb to the slaughter unless something incredibly precious is being held hostage. He had not just paid off my father's astronomical financial debts. He had quietly, ruthlessly reached back into the toxic ruins of my old life and rescued my heart. He had stripped Eleanor of her leverage and placed my most vulnerable treasure in the safest room of his fortress, leaving the drawer unlocked for me to find when I was ready. Resting at the bottom of the cedarwood box, beneath the charcoal sketches, was a small, heavy piece of cream cardstock. It was not my mother's handwriting. It was written in sharp, decisive strokes of black fountain pen ink. It was the exact same handwriting that had signed the marriage registry beside my trembling name. It contained a profound, quiet vow. It promised that my future was entirely mine to author, and he would be waiting wherever that journey led. I sat in his study until the sun dipped below the tree line, holding the cedarwood box in my lap, feeling the overwhelming, terrifying weight of being truly seen by another human being. For the next 2 months, that piece of cardstock remained tucked safely under my pillow. It was a silent promise I carried into the deep quiet of our daily routines. By the 6th month, a brutal winter storm descended upon the Pacific Northwest, wrapping Thornwood Manor in a suffocating shroud of white. The temperature plummeted, and the wind howled around the stone turrets like a wounded animal, rattling the tall crescent glass of the windows. The storm severed the roads, turning the sprawling estate into an isolated island of warmth and light, amidst a dark, freezing ocean of snow. For 3 days, Thomas did not leave for the city. We spent our hours in the library, the roaring fire standing as our only defense against the bitter draft that crept through the heavy stone walls. The crescent glass windows frosted over, the intricate crystalline patterns obscuring the dark cedar forest outside. We were completely cut off from the rest of the world. No phone calls, no corporate ledgers, no obligations. Just the crackle of the hearth, the scent of burning wood, and the comforting scrape of Thomas turning the pages of his book. I had never known what it felt like to be completely sheltered. My entire life had been a series of exposures, to debt, to cruelty, to the constant threat of eviction. Now wrapped in a thick wool blanket on the velvet sofa, I watched the flames dance and realized I was no longer bracing for a blow. It was a period of profound, insular peace. But peace, I was quickly learning, is a fragile architecture. It was just past 8 in the evening. We were sitting by the hearth, the chamomile tea set resting on the low table between us. The only sounds in the room were the violent lashing of ice against the window panes and the occasional pop of a burning cedar log. I was turning the page of a worn novel when a sharp, urgent knock at the heavy double door shattered the calm. Thomas looked up, a slight frown creasing his brow. "Come in," he called out, his resonant voice cutting through the quiet. The heavy doors groaned open, revealing Mrs. Gable, the estate's stoic, loyal housekeeper. She did not usually interrupt us during the evening hours, respecting the silent boundaries Thomas had established. But tonight, her usually placid face was tight with apprehension. In her hands, she carried a small silver tray, and resting on the polished metal was a folded slip of yellow paper, a telegram. "I apologize for the intrusion, sir," Mrs. Gable said, her voice barely audible over the roaring wind outside. The telegraph lines in the village just went down due to the ice, but the operator managed to relay this message for the estate just before the blackout. He said it was marked with the highest urgency. Thomas did not reach for it immediately. His dark eyes flicked from the yellow paper to my face, reading the sudden, visceral tightening of my posture. He gestured for Mrs. Gable to place the tray on the mahogany table between us. The housekeeper did so with a polite nod, and quickly retreated, pulling the heavy door shut behind her, sealing us back into the room with the intrusion. The yellow paper seemed to glow ominously in the firelight. I did not need to read the contents to know what it was. A cold, creeping dread wrapped around my ribs, squeezing the air from my lungs. The fragile sanctuary I had built over the last half-year suddenly felt like it was made of glass, entirely incapable of withstanding the blunt force of reality. Thomas picked up the telegram. He unfolded the stiff paper with a sharp, crisp rustle. His eyes scanned the brief lines of text. I watched his face meticulously, searching for a shift, a softening, a spark of recognition or regret. But his expression remained a mask of impenetrable winter stone. "It is from Beatrice," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotional inflection. The name struck the air like a physical blow. Beatrice, my glamorous center of attention stepsister, the rightful bride, the woman whose expensive, oversized gown I had worn to the altar, like a beggar wrapped in stolen gold. The phantom who had haunted the edges of my new life was suddenly standing at the threshold, demanding to be let back in. "What does it say?" I asked, and I hated how small, how fractured my voice sounded in the vast room. Thomas looked directly into my eyes, holding my gaze with an intensity that burned. He read the words aloud, granting them no power, reciting them as if they were a mundane grocery list. "Made a terrible mistake. Returning to Thornwood this week to correct the error. Prepare the house. Expecting full reinstatement. Beatrice Harlow." My hands, which had been resting in my lap, began to tremble. The old, deeply ingrained trauma response violently hijacked my nervous system. I remembered the fear of being cast aside, of being the invisible mender of torn seams, of being a temporary placeholder, holding a seat warm for the favorite daughter. I was a substitute, a transaction, and the original commodity had just announced her return to claim her property. She had likely heard the rumors of Thomas's vast wealth, realizing too late the empire she had abandoned. Now she wanted it back. I reached for my teacup, a desperate, clumsy attempt to ground myself in our physical routine, to pretend that the yellow paper on the table had not just erased my existence, but my fingers lacked all coordination. As I lifted the heavy indigo ceramic, a violent shudder racked my wrist. The cup slipped. Hot chamomile tea splashed down violently, missing the saucer entirely. It poured directly over the telegram, instantly soaking the yellow paper, blurring Beatrice's demanding, arrogant ink into a dark, muddy smear. The scalding liquid continued its path, splashing over the edge of the mahogany table and landing directly onto my bare wrist and the pale skin of my hand. I gasped, a sharp intake of breath, shrinking back into the velvet sofa. I scrambled to pull the ruined telegram away, to apologize for the mess, to play the role of the clumsy, inadequate substitute who ruined expensive things. But Thomas moved faster. He did not look at the telegram. He did not care that the urgent message from his original chosen bride was currently dissolving into a wet, unreadable pulp on his expensive mahogany table. He did not care about the mess or the ruined demand for a full reinstatement. He surged forward from his leather armchair, closing the distance between us in a single fluid motion. He knelt directly on the woven rug beside my sofa, his massive frame blocking out the firelight. From the pocket of his dark trousers, he pulled a crisp, white linen handkerchief. He reached it out and gently, firmly caught my trembling wrist in his warm, calloused grip. The contrast between his ruthless reputation and the absolute tender care in his hands was staggering. He pressed the soft linen to my scalded skin, absorbing the hot tea, his touch so deliberate and careful it felt like a vow. I sat frozen, staring down at his dark hair, watching the architect of our silent sanctuary kneel on a rug to dry the hands of his substitute wife. He didn't ask about the pain. He didn't ask why I was shaking. He simply kept his thumb pressed gently against my pulse point, grounding my erratic heartbeat with his own steady rhythm. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his voice a low, heavy rumble. His eyes flicked up to meet mine, seeking permission, ensuring my boundaries were intact, even in the aftermath of the shock. I couldn't speak. I could only shake my head. A microscopic fraction of a movement, granting him the silent right to stay. He slowly wiped the last drops of tea from between my fingers, folding the damp linen away. He did not let go of my hand. He held it there, resting against his knee, the heat of his palm seeping into my chilled skin. The storm outside seemed to fade into a distant, irrelevant hum against the heavy silence of the library. Finally, he turned his head slowly, casting a dark, dismissive glare at the ruined yellow paper dissolving on the table. "The house is already prepared," Thomas said quietly, his gaze returning to mine, his thumb brushing a slow, deliberate circle over my knuckles. "And it is currently occupied by the only woman who will ever hold its keys." His words were not loud, but they carried the undeniable weight of absolute certainty. He was not looking for an escape. He was not waiting for the rightful bride. My fingers, still resting in his warm grip, stopped trembling. For the first time since my stepsister's name was spoken, I drew a full, steady breath, letting the ghost of her memory shatter against the unbreakable stone of his quiet devotion. The ice gripping the crescent glass windows of Thornwood Manor began to thaw exactly 2 days after the ruined telegrams had dissolved into a dark stain on the mahogany table. The violent lashing of the winter storm had softened into a steady, quiet rain, washing away the pristine white isolation that had briefly shielded us from the outside world. I stood near the edge of the vast stone foyer, my hands folded loosely in front of my simple wool dress, listening to the heavy, rhythmic dripping of water from the ancient cedar eaves. The absolute silence of the estate was shifting, bracing itself for an inevitable collision. The crunch of heavy tires rolling over the wet gravel of the long driveway broke the morning calm. It was a harsh mechanical sound that tore through the natural quiet of the forest, signaling the arrival of the vehicle. Mrs. Gaisville had spotted approaching from the main gate. My pulse gave a singular, heavy thud against my ribs, but the violent, unmoored terror that used to consume me in my stepmother's presence did not rise. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling the phantom warmth of a calloused thumb pressing against my wrist. I was no longer the desperate, terrified girl who had been shoved into a hired car on her wedding day. The sanctuary had done its work. The stone walls had seeped into my spine. The massive oak front doors groaned inward, pulled open by the stoic housekeeper. A sharp gust of damp, freezing air rushed into the foyer, carrying with it the overwhelming, suffocating scent of synthetic floral perfume. It cut through the natural aroma of beeswax and old wood like a jagged blade. Beatrice stepped over the threshold. My stepsister looked exactly as she had the day she fled her own wedding. She was draped in an ostentatious, heavy fur coat, her flawless blonde hair perfectly arranged. Despite the miserable weather, her lips painted a severe, demanding shade of crimson. She did not pause to acknowledge Mrs. Gable, nor did she wipe her expensive leather boots on the mat. She simply walked into the center of the cavernous hall, her sharp heels clicking aggressively against the cold marble floor, expecting the very architecture of the house to bow to her presence. Close behind her was Eleanor. My stepmother's sharp, calculating eyes immediately began darting across the high vaulted ceilings, the antique tapestries, and the heavy stone archways. I could see the greed calculating in her mind, tallying the immense, staggering wealth of the Thornwood empire that she had almost allowed to slip through her fingers. Beatrice stopped in the middle of the foyer, her perfectly manicured hands resting on her hips. She wrinkled her nose, a dramatic expression of profound distaste, and let out a loud, theatrical sigh. "What on earth is that smell?" Beatrice demanded, her voice echoing shrilly off the stone walls, entirely devoid of the quiet reverence this house usually commanded. She waved a gloved hand in front of her face as if clearing away a toxic fog. "It smells like cheap soap and dried weeds in here. I will have the staff air out the entire wing by this afternoon." She was talking about the lavender, the raw, earthy scent of my mother's memory, the fragrance that Thomas had deliberately placed on my vanity to anchor me, was nothing more than a nuisance to her. A sudden, fierce wave of protective instinct flared in my chest. In the past, I would have immediately rushed forward to apologize, to hide the glass vial away, to accommodate her endless, petty demands. But standing there in the dim light of the foyer, I did not move. I did not shrink. I merely watched her perform, finally understanding how small and hollow her grand theatrics truly were. Eleanor finally spotted me standing near the base of the grand staircase. Her eyes narrowed into dark, vicious slits. She did not see a woman who had spent 6 months building a quiet life. She saw a piece of misplaced collateral. She handed her wet umbrella to a perfectly still Mrs. Gable and marched across the marble floor, her footsteps sharp and predatory. Before I could take a breath, Eleanor reached out and clamped her fingers around my upper arm. Her grip was punishing, her sharp nails digging through the thick wool of my sleeve, attempting to reassert the physical dominance she had wielded over me for a decade. She pulled me roughly toward the shadow of a stone pillar, away from the immediate earshot of the housekeeper, her face leaning in so close I could smell the bitter mint on her breath. "This is how you pay me back," Eleanor hissed, her voice a venomous high thread designed to cut deep. "After everything I did to keep a roof over your pathetic head, you try to steal your sister's life? You think because you sat in his house for a few months that you belong here?" I looked down at the hand gripping my arm. The contrast was staggering. Thomas had touched my skull with the reverence of a man handling fragile glass, asking permission before he even wiped away a drop of tea. Eleanor grabbed me like a piece of livestock being dragged back to the pen. "I signed a legal document, Eleanor," I said, my voice shockingly level. It did not tremble. It did not break. "My name is on the registry." Eleanor's eyes flared with manic, desperate anger. She leaned closer, her whisper turning into a ragged threat. "A document built on fraud. I will tell him exactly what happened. I will tell him you forced your way into that dress, that you lied to the priest, that you manipulated the entire ceremony, while my poor Beatrice was recovering from an illness. Thomas Thornwood is a ruthless man. When he finds out you made a fool of him in front of the entire county, he will throw you out into the freezing rain without a single penny. You will pack your bags right now, Clara, or I will destroy you." It was a masterful, terrifying lie. It was the exact kind of psychological warfare she had used to keep my father in line until the day he died. She was relying entirely on the assumption that Thomas and I lived in a state of hostile silence, that I was too terrified of the scarred tycoon to ever speak to him. She did not know about the chipped indigo teacups. She did not know about the cedarwood box safely tucked inside his desk. She did not know that her leverage had evaporated months ago. "Hey, you!" Beatrice's sharp, demanding voice snapped across the foyer, shattering Eleanor's whispered threats. I turned my head. My stepsister was standing beside a towering pile of heavy, brass-bound leather trunks that the driver had unceremoniously dumped inside the doorway. Beatrice pointed a crimson fingernail directly at me, snapping her fingers twice in rapid succession. "Stop hovering in the shadows and make yourself useful," Beatrice commanded, her tone identical to the one she used when demanding I hem her skirts in the drafty sewing room. "Take the brown leather trunk up to the master suite immediately, the heavy one, and then go find whatever miserable little guest room you've been hiding in, and pack your things. I expect you gone before dinner." Eleanor released my arm, a triumphant, cruel smirk twisting her lips. She stepped back, crossing her arms over her chest, waiting for me to break. They both waited for the tears. They waited for me to beg, to plead for a small allowance, to start a loud, humiliating argument that Beatrice could use to prove how unstable and unsuitable I was for high society. I looked at the heavy leather trunk. I looked at Beatrice's smug, flawless face, and then I simply walked forward. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to defend my honor, or declare my status as the lady of the house. Arguing would mean acknowledging their delusion as a valid threat. Instead, I walked calmly across the marble floor, my soft shoes making barely a sound. I reached the pile of luggage. I bent my knees, gripping the thick, cold leather handles of the largest trunk. The brass fittings dug sharply into my palms, cold and unforgiving. I engaged my shoulders and lifted the immense weight of Beatrice's manufactured life off the floor. The sheer, profound quiet of my obedience paradoxically sucked all the air out of the room. By refusing to fight, by refusing to play the hysterical victim they so desperately wanted, Their loud demands suddenly echoed hollowly off the stone walls. I stood there, holding the heavy trunk, my spine perfectly straight, maintaining an absolute, unyielding dignity that manual labor could never strip away. I was a mender of torn seams. I was not afraid of heavy things. Beatrice frowned, clearly unsettled by my silence, her victory feeling strangely empty. She opened her mouth to issue another sharp command, but the words never left her throat. A set of footsteps echoed from the upper gallery. They were slow. They were incredibly heavy. They struck the polished wood of the grand staircase with the measured, terrifying cadence of a predator descending from the high ground. Thomas Thornwood emerged from the shadows of the second-floor landing. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit that seemed to absorb the dim light of the foyer. His broad shoulders blocked the pale illumination from the crescent window behind him, casting his angular, scarred profile into sharp relief. His expression was a mask of pure, impenetrable winter stone. The temperature in the massive hall seemed to plummet 10 degrees the moment his dark eyes swept over the scene below. Beatrice's unsettled frown vanished instantly, replaced by a radiant saccharine smile that she had perfected over years of social climbing. She completely ignored the fact that she had abandoned this man at the altar. She smoothed the front of her expensive fur coat and took 3 eager, confident steps toward the base of the staircase, tilting her head to expose the elegant line of her neck. "Thomas, darling," Beatrice cooed, her voice dripping with a manufactured warmth that made my stomach turn. "I know this must be a shock. I had to go away to recover from the most dreadful illness, and my poor mother was so panicked she sent this clumsy little mouse in my place. But I am back now. The nightmare is over. I am ready to take my rightful place by your side." Thomas reached the bottom step. He did not pause. He did not offer a polite nod. Beatrice, emboldened by his silence, reached out, her manicured hand extended gracefully, aiming to rest affectionately upon the dark wool of his forearm. A possessive gesture meant to establish her immediate dominance over the space and the man. She never made contact. Thomas did not flinch, nor did he swat her hand away in anger. With devastating surgical precision, he simply shifted his weight and took one deliberate step backward. The movement was entirely smooth, yet it carried the violent force of a slamming iron door. The physical distance he created was an unbridgeable chasm. Beatrice's hand grabbed nothing but empty, cold air. Her smile faltered, a genuine flicker of confusion and deep humiliation cracking her flawless facade. She stood there with her arm, awkwardly suspended in the space between them, entirely rejected without a single word being spoken. Thomas did not even look at her face. His dark, intense gaze bypassed the glamorous woman dripping in fur and locked entirely on me. He looked at my pale face, my straight spine, and the heavy leather trunk I was carrying in my raw, red hands. His jaw tightened, a dangerous, barely perceptible flex of muscle beneath the skin of his cheek. He walked past Beatrice, as if she were a piece of misplaced, irrelevant furniture. He crossed the marble floor, the sharp sound of his leather shoes echoing like gunshots in the silent foyer, until he stood directly in front of me. "Put it down," Thomas commanded. His voice was a low, resonant rumble, entirely devoid of the anger Eleanor had predicted, but heavy with an absolute, terrifying authority. I held his gaze for a second, feeling the undeniable weight of his protection wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. Slowly, I bent my knees and lowered the trunk. It hit the marble floor with a dull, resounding thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of my stepmother's plans. Eleanor, realizing the script was falling apart, scrambled forward, her heels clicking frantically. "Mr. Thornwood, please, you must understand the deception you've been subjected to. Clara is nothing but a bitter, jealous girl who took advantage of my daughter's tragic illness. She has no right to be in this house. Beatrice is your true Eleanor." Thomas spoke her name only once. He did not shout. He did not raise his volume above a conversational cadence. But the sheer, crushing gravity in that single word forced my stepmother's jaw to snap shut instantly. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying, and total. Thomas slowly turned his head, finally acknowledging the 2 intruders standing in his foyer. He looked at them with the cold, clinical detachment of a man inspecting an infestation of rot in a piece of salvageable wood. I am a man who builds empires from the ground up, Thomas said, his voice slicing through the damp air with lethal precision. Do you honestly believe I do not read the contracts I sign? Do you believe I do not know the exact name, the exact handwriting, and the exact worth of the woman standing at my altar? Eleanor visibly recoiled, all the color draining from her sharp face. The desperate lie she had threatened me with just moments ago crumbled into dust. He knew he had always known. Beatrice, utterly humiliated by the physical rejection and desperate to reclaim the narrative, let out a forced, nervous laugh. Thomas, surely you are joking. You cannot possibly want her. Look at her. She is a maid. She is a shadow. She doesn't even know how to speak in polite society. I am the woman you chose. I am the one who belongs in this estate. Thomas shifted his gaze back to me. He looked at the simple wool of my dress, at the hands that had mended torn seams and brewed midnight tea, at the quiet resilience I had refused to surrender. You are mistaken, Thomas said flatly, his dark eyes never leaving my face. You were an arrangement, a line item on a ledger meant to secure a merger. You fled because you were terrified of the dark. The woman standing before me walked into the dark willingly, took the weight of a debt she did not owe, and signed her own name to save a family that did not deserve her. He reached out, closing the small distance between us. He did not care that my stepmother and stepsister were watching with wide, horrified eyes. He gently took my right hand, the same hand he had dried with his linen handkerchief the night before, the same hand that had just carried the heavy burden of my past. With his free hand, Thomas reached into the interior pocket of his dark suit jacket. He withdrew a heavy antique iron ring. Attached to it were the master keys of Thornwood Manor. They were the physical embodiment of the estate, the ultimate symbol of authority, access, and ownership over the vast, reclusive empire. He turned my hand over, his callous thumb brushing gently over my palm. Slowly, deliberately, he placed the heavy iron ring into the center of my hand. The metal was cold at first, but it quickly began to warm against my skin. He folded my trembling fingers over the keys, encasing my hand within his own solid, unyielding grip. He finally turned his head to look at Beatrice, his expression entirely devoid of mercy. My wife is not your staff, Thomas declared, the absolute finality of his words echoing through the cavernous foyer. She is the only woman who will ever hold the keys to this house, and this estate is currently closed to visitors. Mrs. Gable will see you to the door. He did not wait for their outrage. He did not stay to watch Eleanor sputter in shock, or to see Beatrice's perfectly painted face contort in furious disbelief. He simply kept his hand wrapped securely over mine, the heavy iron keys resting safely between our palms, and gently guided me away from the cold marble of the foyer, leading me back toward the quiet, warm sanctuary of the library wing. The heavy iron keys remained in my hand long after the massive oak doors of the foyer had closed, shutting out the shrill, demanding voices of my past. Thomas had guided me back to the library wing in absolute silence. He did not ask for my gratitude, nor did he demand a celebration of his loyalty. He had simply released my hand, his dark eyes lingering on my face for a long, heavy moment, before he turned and walked toward his private study. He had corporate fires to put out, legal boundaries to enforce to ensure Eleanor could never threaten the estate again. I was left alone in the vast, cedar-scented room, the master keys resting heavily against my palm. The metal was still warm from his grip. I ran my thumb over the jagged iron teeth. These keys represented immense power, an untouchable fortress of wealth that could shield me forever from women like my stepmother. For a long time, I just stood by the bay window, watching the rain wash over the crescent glass. He had chosen me. He had looked at the glamorous, original bride and dismissed her without a second thought, anchoring his entire world to the quiet mender of torn seams. But as the afternoon light faded into a bruised, melancholic purple, the heavy iron in my hand began to feel less like a shield and more like a gilded chain. The victory in the foyer had been absolute, yet the foundation beneath my feet still felt borrowed. I looked down at the keys. They had been given to a woman who had arrived as collateral. Our entire existence together, no matter how beautifully it had evolved into a sanctuary of shared tea and quiet reading, had been born from a toxic ledger. I was still a debt bride. I had been traded to settle a financial ruin I did not create. I realized then that I could not stay. Not like this. I refused to transition from a victim of my stepmother's greed to a kept woman shielded by my husband's formidable pity. If Thomas and I were ever going to have a true partnership, it could not be built on the bones of a forced contract. I had to strip the transaction away entirely. I had to step out of his fortress and stand on my own ground. The decision did not bring tears. It brought a strange, steadying peace. I walked into the attached dressing room, the chill of the marble floor grounding my resolve. I did not touch the expensive silk garments or the heavy winter coats the architect of our silent sanctuary had ordered for the estate. I reached into the back of the wardrobe and pulled out the simple, worn wool dresses I had brought with me from my old life. I folded the garments, pressing the creases flat with the heel of my palm, feeling the rough, familiar bite of the fabric against my skin. I packed them into a single, modest canvas valise. From the vanity, I took the small, dark amber glass vial of lavender. I held it to my chest for a second, drawing strength from the earthy, herbaceous scent of my mother's memory, before tucking it safely between the layers of wool. Next, I walked into the study. The room was empty, the fire in the hearth reduced to glowing embers. I opened the drawer of the massive desk and lifted out the cedarwood box. The brass latch gave a soft click against the silence of the room. I placed it carefully into my bag. I took nothing else. I did not take a single coin of Thornwood money. I walked back to the center of the library and approached the low mahogany table, where we shared our midnight ritual. I placed the heavy ring of master keys precisely in the center of the wood, resting right beside his chipped indigo teacup. It was a silent resignation. I zipped the valise shut. When I stepped out into the dimly lit corridor, Mrs. Gable was already waiting near the servants' stairwell. The stoic housekeeper looked at the bag in my hand, her expression unreadable at first. She did not ask if I had been banished. She did not assume I was running away in fear. She looked into my eyes and saw the quiet, unyielding dignity that had finally taken root in my spine. She nodded slowly, an unspoken understanding passing between us. "The coastal village," Martha Gable said quietly, her voice barely a whisper in the echoing hall. "The one I told you about during our quiet mornings in the pantry. My sister owns a vacant cottage near the cliffs there. It is drafty, and the roof sings when the wind blows, but it belongs to no one of importance. The Thornwood name holds no weight there." I gave her a slow, grateful nod. She did not alert the estate drivers. Instead, she personally guided me through the labyrinth of the servant corridors, leading me out a side door into the damp, freezing evening. She arranged for a local grocer's delivery truck, which was returning to the coast, to take me as a passenger. As I climbed into the cab, smelling of damp earth and diesel, I looked back at the towering stone gables of the manor just once. I was leaving the safest place I had ever known, walking back into the cold. But this time I was choosing the cold on my own terms. The journey west was a blur of dark highways and the relentless, hypnotic rhythm of windshield wipers. Inside the cab, the rattling heater blew a dry, mechanical warmth that felt miles away from the deep, roaring stone hearths of the manor. The heavy, oppressive scent of ancient cedar forests gradually thinned, surrendering to the sharp, biting tang of sea salt and freezing brine as we crested the final ridge. By the time the truck deposited me at the edge of the coastal village, the air had fundamentally changed. The cottage was exactly as the housekeeper had described. It sat isolated on a jagged bluff, overlooking the churning, gray expanse of the Pacific. It was small, weathered by decades of coastal storms, with peeling white paint and a chimney that leaned slightly to the left. I unlocked the front door with a rusted brass key and stepped inside. The space was freezing, smelling of dust and old driftwood. There were no towering mahogany shelves, no crescent glass windows, no roaring stone hearths. There was just a single room with a cast-iron stove, a narrow bed, and bare wooden floorboards. It was the most beautiful place I had ever seen. For the first 3 days, I threw myself into physical labor. I scrubbed the floors on my hands and knees until the water ran clear. I chopped my own kindling, my hands blistering and cracking in the salty air, entirely unbothered by the sting. On the 4th morning, I walked down to the village market. I had just enough saved coin in my old coat pocket to purchase a few groceries and a small, rough wooden table from a local carpenter. It was an imperfect piece, built from reclaimed driftwood, the surface scarred and uneven. I dragged it all the way back up the bluff myself, the physical exertion, burning in my shoulders and lungs, forcing every lingering shadow of Eleanor's psychological control out of my body. I placed the table beneath the only window in the cottage, which looked out over the restless ocean. I spent hours sanding the rough edges down with a piece of grit paper. A tiny splinter caught under my thumbnail, a sharp, grounding prick of pain that belonged only to me. I inhaled the scent of raw timber and sea air. When the wood was finally smooth to the touch, I unpacked my bag. I placed my mother's cedarwood box squarely in the center of the table. I opened the brass latch, untied the faded velvet ribbon, and spread the yellowed letters out across the grain. I sat in a mismatched wooden chair, looking at the elegant handwriting, listening to the deafening roar of the waves crashing against the cliffs below. I was entirely alone. I had no fortune, no title, and no protector. But as I ran my hand over the smooth, sanded wood of the table I had bought and carried with my own strength, a profound, unshakable peace settled into my bones. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. I had built my own sanctuary. I had finally claimed my own space in the world, free from any contract, any debt, or any expectation. I brewed a cup of cheap black tea on the cast iron stove, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic, and watched the gray horizon. I missed him. The ache in my chest was a heavy, constant physical pressure. I missed the smell of his dark wool coat, the rumble of his voice, the quiet way he slid the sugar bowl across the table. But I knew that if he truly understood me, if he truly saw the woman who had folded back her oversized lace sleeves at the altar, he would know exactly why I had to leave. The storm rolled in on the evening of the 7th day. It was not the violent, ice-laden blizzard of the cedar forests, but a soft, relentless coastal rain that blanketed the bluff in a thick silver mist. The drops tapped a gentle, rhythmic cadence against the tin roof of the cottage. I had just lit the cast iron stove, the small fire casting a warm amber glow across the wooden floorboards, when a sound cut through the noise of the rain. It was a knock. 3 slow, deliberate strikes against the weathered wood of my front door. My breath hitched violently in my throat. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. I did not rush. I walked slowly across the small room, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I reached out, my fingers wrapping around the rusted iron latch, and pulled the door open. Thomas Thornwood stood on my narrow, wooden porch. He looked entirely out of place, yet absolutely perfect. The untouchable architect of corporate empires had been stripped of his intimidating armor. He wore a simple, dark wool coat that was soaked through, the heavy fabric clinging to his broad shoulders. Rain dripped steadily from his dark hair, trailing down the scarred, angular planes of his face. There was no luxury town car idling in the driveway. There was no entourage of assistants or drivers. His leather shoes were caked with coastal mud. He had walked all the way up the bluff in the pouring rain. He looked massive, standing framed in the doorway of my tiny cottage, a giant of a man, accustomed to towering over boardrooms and estates. But he did not step forward. He did not push his way out of the freezing rain and into the warmth of the room. He remained exactly where he was, his boots planted firmly on the wet, wooden planks of the porch, the rain beating relentlessly against his back. He was waiting for my permission to cross the threshold of a house he did not own. We stood there in silence, separated by the invisible boundary of the doorway. His dark eyes searched my face, stripping away the weeks of distance, reading the blistered calluses on my hands, and the quiet defiance in my posture. He did not look angry. He looked at me with a profound, staggering reverence. "You left the keys," Thomas said, his voice a low, rough rumble that barely carried over the sound of the ocean. It was a statement of fact, devoid of accusation. "I couldn't keep them," I replied, my voice steady, surprising even myself. "They belonged to a debt. They belonged to a transaction designed to save a family I no longer recognize. I will not be the prize of a contract, Thomas. I will not be a substitute for the woman who fled, and I will not be a charity case to be pitied and sheltered." Thomas did not blink. The water continued to run down his face, soaking into the collar of his coat, but he seemed entirely oblivious to the cold. Slowly, he reached into the interior pocket of his jacket, He withdrew a folded piece of thick, high-quality parchment. It was the original marriage contract. The document that Eleanor had orchestrated, the ledger that had bound me to him as collateral. With a calm, deliberate motion, the tycoon gripped the edges of the parchment. His large hands flexed, and he tore the heavy paper straight down the middle. The sound of the ripping fibers was sharp and final. He placed the two halves together and tore them again, reducing the toxic, transactional foundation of our marriage into meaningless scraps. He let the pieces fall from his fingers. The coastal wind caught them instantly, scattering the white fragments out into the dark, freezing rain, carrying them over the bluff and down into the churning sea. The debt was gone. The ledger was empty. Then, the man who had quietly guarded my mother's letters did something that made the breath completely vanish from my lungs. He didn't step into the house. Instead, right there on the weathered, rain-slicked wooden boards of my porch, Thomas lowered himself. He bent his knee, the wet fabric of his trousers pressing into the mud and puddles of the deck, surrendering his towering height until he was kneeling in the pouring rain. Looking up at me, he stripped away the last ounce of his pride, laying his formidable power at the feet of a woman who owned nothing but a rough wooden table and a box of old letters. He reached into his pocket one last time and pulled out a fresh, pristine piece of cream cardstock. It was completely dry, protected fiercely against the storm. He held it out to me. My hands trembled as I took it. I didn't need to unfold it to know what it said, but I opened it anyway. Written in sharp, decisive strokes of black fountain pen ink were the words I had carried in my heart for months. Write the life you want. I'll meet you there. There is no contract, Thomas whispered, looking up at me, his dark eyes entirely stripped of their winter stone, laid bare in raw, absolute vulnerability. There is no debt. There is no arrangement. There is only a man kneeling in the rain, asking a woman who mends torn things if she would do him the honor of building a life together. From the ground up, on your terms. A hot tear slipped down my cheek, mingling with the mist blowing in from the sea. I looked at the man kneeling in the mud, this beautiful, scarred protector who had silently memorized how I took my tea, who had rescued my mother's letters from the fire, who had walked away from his empire just to stand outside my door and ask for permission to enter. I folded the cardstock and clutched it to my chest. I took a step back, opening the wooden door wider, breaking the invisible boundary between us. "Come in," I whispered, my voice breaking on a sob of pure, overwhelming relief. "Come out of the cold, Thomas." He rose slowly, his massive frame shedding the rain, and stepped over the threshold. He didn't demand a grand declaration. He simply reached out and gently cupped my face in his large, freezing hands, his thumbs tracing the line of my jaw with devastating tenderness. I closed my eyes, leaning entirely into his touch, feeling the last remaining walls of my isolation crumble into dust. We stood in the entryway of the tiny cottage, the storm raging outside, wrapped in a silence that was no longer a shield, but a profound, unbreakable bond. Later that evening, after he had dried off and changed into a simple borrowed wool sweater I had bought from the village, we sat together on the braided rug in front of the cast-iron stove. I brewed a fresh pot of chamomile tea. I didn't have the chipped indigo cups from the manor. I only had 2 cheap, mismatched ceramic mugs. I poured the hot, fragrant liquid and handed one to him. He took it with both hands, his calloused fingers brushing against mine, a quiet smile softening the harsh lines of his face. He didn't ask when we were going back to the estate. He didn't ask if I wanted to return to the library wing. He simply sat beside me, in the tiny, drafty room, perfectly content to inhabit the sanctuary I had built for myself. As the warmth of the fire chased the chill from the air, and the scent of chamomile and sea salt filled the room, I finally understood the truth I had been running toward all along. Home isn't a place or a name. It's a person. And for the first time in my life, looking at the man sipping tea from a mismatched mug by a humble fire, I knew with absolute certainty that I was home. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. If this quiet story found a safe harbor in your evening, please leave a like and subscribe to sit with us again.